you're known for famously turning back the boats and assisting in the implementation of this quite hard-line policy towards illegal immigration, which we've seen cause so many problems in the United States and in the UK. How did that come about, and just explain to non-Australians what that process was?
Well, I was a staffer for John Hewson back in the days of the Hawke-Keating government, and I very much formed the view back then in my staffer days that a country which loses control of its borders ultimately loses its sovereignty. Now, we never lost control of our borders to anything like the extent that the US did across the Rio Grande and Britain has across the Channel, because it is actually harder to come to Australia other than across the Torres Strait from PNG, and for all sorts of reasons that hasn't become a problem. And what I did as Prime Minister was build on the three Howard elements, which were temporary protection visas for those who did get to Australia, offshore processing for those who we had to pick up at sea, and where possible, boat turnarounds so that they never really came into our control. The difficulty which arose in the Rudd-Gillard era was that
these are your predecessors.
Yeah, my predecessors on the other side of the fence, was that the people smugglers developed this tactic of scuttling their boats when our ships hove into view, which meant we had to pick them up. And of course, in the Rudd-Gillard era, they came to Christmas Island. They were then kind of enveloped in the kind of activist lawyer ecosystem,
because that's an Australian territory, so they're into our refugee system.
Exactly right. So they can get sort of social justice lawyers, go before various tribunals, appeal their way through the system, and 10 or 15 years later, they're still here. I mean, you wouldn't believe the number of Uber drivers who, when they've worked out who I am, Josh, have told me the story of how they came by boat sometime between 2008 and 2013, and could I please sort out their citizenship status? Anyway.
You're like, you know what I did to boat arrivals, right, mate?
Anyway, so what I did as Prime Minister, assisted by Scott Morrison and Peter Dutton, was when they scuttled their boats and we had to take them on board, instead of taking them to Christmas Island, because the game was up essentially once they got to Christmas Island, instead of taking them there, we would hold them on a mothership where they could not communicate with their activist lawyer friends. They didn't have their mobile phones, etc. And then on a suitable night, we'd put them in a big orange life raft and send them back to Java. And I knew one morning early in 2014 that we had got on top of this when the front page of the Daily Telegraph was a full-page photograph of a big orange life raft washed up on a beach in Java. And I thought, this is going to go through all of the would-be boat people, would-be illegal migrant networks, and they will figure out that giving 10 grand to a people smuggler is just a return ticket back to Java. And the boat stopped then. And for the next 10 years, we didn't have any. And to the credit of the Albanese government, it's largely maintained that policy architecture. We've had a few boats under Anthony Albanese, but the would-be illegal migrants have all been swiftly repatriated, as they should. I mean, so it's worked for us. Britain has completely failed to get on top of this. Do not underestimate the human rights lawyer lobby inside the political establishment, both on the left but also to some extent on the right. For instance, eventually the Conservative government came up with the Rwanda plan, which was a bit like the Howard government's Nauru solution.
And just for foreign listeners, basically this is another component this is the second component that you said of Australia's immigration policy, which is...
If people come illegally by boat, they get transferred to a
different
third country,
either Papua New Guinea,
where they will be safe, but they will be outside the jurisdiction.
Well, you say
of
they'll be
our
safe. I mean,
courts.
that's the other big criticism of your administration and of this policy, right? That Manus Island in Papua New Guinea and that Nauru were places where human rights abuses basically were happening. That they were horrible places.
I don't think that's not fair.
No,
I mean,
it was no picnic.
I don't say that
called desert island concentration.
I don't say that living rough in Port Moresby is a particularly great way to live, but the Manus Island camp was run by, well, there was a strong Australian element in its running. People were fed, they were clothed, they were housed, they were safe. Ditto in Nauru, which is actually not a bad place. I mean, it might not quite be, Hamilton Island, but it's a pretty lovely place, Nauru. So
right, but they were in detention.
In Nauru, they had the run of the island essentially. They would go back at night to the camp, but in Nauru, and I'm talking now about the Howard
Yes.
government, because we didn't need Nauru in my time.
Because you were handing them boats.
Yeah, we were on top of the problem. There were no boats. But in Nauru, they had the run of the island. I'm not quite so sure what the arrangements were in Manus, but to get back to the essential point, when you've got a serious problem of illegal migration by boat, it's run by criminal gangs, and that's bad, and it inevitably involves a lot of drownings at sea. I mean, we think that 1,000+ people died at sea in the Rudd Gillard era. Plainly, dozens of people are dying in the English Channel every month. And the only way to actually be safe is to stop this illegal migration by boat. So it has to be stamped out. It absolutely has to be stamped out. No self-respecting government can do it. But when the British government tried to escalate its response through sending arrivals to Rwanda, there was an immediate application to the courts, and I'm not totally au fait with exactly the mechanics of this, but the deportation of people to Rwanda was stopped because of Britain's adherence to the European Convention on Human Rights, the ECHR. Now, to me, the obvious solution to this is just to abrogate the ECHR, at least insofar as it applies to illegal migration by boat in your country. Parliament could have done that. And given the majority that the Conservatives had, they could have passed it through the House of Commons in a day had they wanted to. But
I mean, in terms of public opinion, it probably doesn't help that Rwanda, the Howard government probably had the benefit of the fact that no one had ever heard of bloody Nauru. So they didn't know. Rwanda doesn't sound like a good look, does it?
Except that. But Rwanda, at least over the last couple of decades, has been a peaceful, even quite a prosperous by African standards country. The other thing the British government could have done, they could have, just as part of the Howard government's response back in the late 90s was Christmas Island, the British government could have opened camps in, say, Ascension Island or Reunion or somewhere, one of the very remote British overseas territories. So there are all sorts of things that the British government could and should have done, up to and including direct action on the beaches of France and very assertive actions in the English Channel. There are all sorts of things that could have been done. But there was, as I said, this scrupulosity on the part of the kind of human rights lobby inside both parties. Now, Sakia Starmer is essentially a human rights lawyer. The Attorney General in the British Labor government is apparently a very noted and outspoken human rights lawyer. I often used to say that moral theologians did not make good statesmen, and similarly, I think human rights lawyers did not make good national leaders.
I mean, you are a moral theologian.
Well, no, I studied.
You
I studied for the priesthood for a couple of years, but I was a failure. I was a dropout.
You're a failed moral theologian. I mean, so let's grant that the leader of a country has a responsibility to secure that nation's borders, but let's talk about the morality of it and the theology of it, if you want, because you are a religious person. So the detention centres, okay. Let's, at the risk of being too dismissive of human rights law here, there was a 23-year-old asylum seeker, Reza Barati, who was killed on Manus when you were PM.
Right.
In 2014, when you were PM, The Guardian and SBS reported that asylum seekers on Nauru had stitched their lips shut as part of a mass hunger strike in protest of what they called catastrophic conditions, including children with their lips sewn shut.
Well, we didn't do that. They did that to themselves.
Yeah, they did that to themselves as a result of the conditions that we'd put them in. In 2015, the same thing happened on Manus Island. ABC News reported that 15 people have sewn their lips together and 400 men are on a hunger strike. And in 2014, your government passed the National Security Legislation Amendment Act, which threatened journalists and doctors and detention centre staffers and teachers and whistleblowers with 10 years in prison if they reported on what was happening in the offshore detention centres. I'm just interested in the theology of this, because we were saying earlier about how the sort of Christian ethic is that people can't be used for a purpose beyond themselves, that they have an intrinsic dignity, right? That's fundamental to your worldview.
Yeah.
And so, the cynic would say, yeah, you can talk about all of the people who aren't dying at sea as a result of these people's hardship, but we're still using these people who are in our duty of care in certainly unseemly ways, aren't we?
Josh, they were always being fed, they were always being clothed, they were always being housed, and there was no violence being committed against them by us or by the people of Nauru and PNG.
Well, I mean, we were jailing them indefinitely with no trial.
We were detaining them. They could always volunteer to leave. Now, I know
they had nowhere to go.
I know there were some complications with countries that wouldn't take back people who'd left and had destroyed passports and things like that. But there were always other things that could have been done. And I don't believe that a national government should be morally intimidated by the bad behaviour of other people that we have in no way forced upon them. I mean, no one is forced to sew his or her lips together. If someone threatens to commit suicide, and I have never mistreated the person who is threatening to commit suicide and demanding something of me, is that my fault?
But it's the if I have never mistreated. The lot's resting on the if I have never mistreated them.
Honestly, these people never had a right to come. See, this is the other thing, Josh. No one who has travelled through several safe countries can claim to be a refugee or can claim asylum. If you're fair income, let's suppose you're a persecuted Afghan, and you come through Pakistan, and then you fly to Malaysia, and then you get to Indonesia. You have come through 3 countries where, okay, you might not get social security, you might not find it easy to get a job, but you are physically safe. And to be a refugee, you have to have a well-founded fear of persecution. By the time you have gone through a safe country, you are no longer a refugee. You are a would-be illegal migrant. In other words, you have no right to rock up on our doorstep or to attempt to enter our country. You just don't have a right. And if people are attempting to do something that they have no right to do, they are violating your country. Just as if someone smashes down your door and enters your house, they are violating your household. They are morally and legally in the wrong. And
if there's a desperate person, Tony, who bashes down your door because they're
A desperate
totally
person
desperate.
a desperate person will knock on the door.
Let's suppose they're not kind enough to do that, and they
Well,
make
if they're
a
not
mistake,
kind enough to do
and
that, they've got
in.
a problem.
Right, but is there a limit to what you can then do to them once they're in your duty of care?
You can
Don't you have a duty? Doesn't the Christian in you think that you have a duty of care to their well-being?
You have a duty to do what you can to alleviate the circumstances that might have led to that problem. But once they take the law into their own hands and violate what is your sacred space, you don't have to put up with that for a second.